the semester before COVID started.
The month.
That moment, right? The moment before COVID started, we didn't know what was coming. I get an email from a Felipe Hinojosa, who's a professor. I never heard of the man, but whatever. Okay, he's in Texas. Bad news already. Texas, from New York. Hello. Okay. But it's a very nice email. Calls me Dr. Fernandez, and
did I really? Did I? Yeah.
No, he calls me Dr. Fernandez. All the things that professors do to each other to bow their heads to their colleagues. And he invites me to Texas A&M, which is in Carajo land, and I'm saying, okay, great, wonderful. Yes, I'm there. And you're going to give me a decent honorarium because I do all kinds of things for free. I'm there. All right. So, we're in the back and forth, and you know how it is when you're going to do an event. It's like a million emails back and forth. I can't figure out what was the last email, what I last said. Anyway, the big deal for me was that I needed to get to where I was going to get on my own. I didn't need anybody to pick me up. And Felipe was like, oh no, I'll pick you up from the airport. And I'm like, no, it's an hour away from the airport. You're bringing me to some crazy place. I'm fine getting there on my own. I'm from New York. I'm from the Bronx. Thank you very much. He says,
you didn't know where you were coming to.
I didn't know. Listen, I get there. The man is there waiting for me at the airport. And then he proceeds to take me through Freddy Krueger Road.
Wait a minute. It's like 11 o'clock at night. You have to say that. It's like midnight. It's really late.
Freddy Krueger Road. It's Freddy Krueger Road. So I'm like, oh, I'm glad your ass picked me up because I am in Texas. I forget.
That's what I told you.
So I'm hungry. It's 11 o'clock and I'm hungry. I haven't eaten. And I'm like, I need to eat. And he's like, everything is closed. And I'm like, wait, aren't you big and bad in Texas and everything is closed? What? No, I'm from New York. Everything should be open and I'm hungry. Okay, so I break down and decide that I'm going to do the McDonald's food, which I haven't done since junior high school, probably.
Which I didn't judge you. I thought that's great. She still eats McDonald's. Whatever. I didn't know that. That was a surprise to me. But I'm fine with that.
Okay, so you carry on the story.
Well, you proceeded. We're in Caldwell, Texas, by the way, Central Texas, and we are at a McDonald's, and it's about 2 a.m. And you ordered whatever the McNugget big package is. They were like, we got a small one. They're like, no, give me I want the big one. And we're in there, and I'm just sort of trying to make small. What's it like living in New York? Are there a lot of people? Stupid questions. Just ridiculous. And then you were like, so we're going back, and then we're sitting there. We're thinking this is taking a long time. We were in that drive-through for at least 30 minutes, right? And we were there for a while. The people, I'm sure, folks were high. It was late at night. It was a Wednesday night, whatever it was. And you finally got your nuggets, and I think you might have just eaten one and maybe a fry, and then you were like, I think I'm good after that. But we made it to College Station, Texas. But that's what I told you. I was like, you're not going to drive from Austin to College Station at 1 a.m. No te voy a dejar. That's just not the way. We don't do it like that in Texas. So
on Freddy Krueger Road, thank God.
Exactly.
Y'all know who Freddy Krueger is, right? Maybe we're dating ourselves. So I am sure that the people at McDonald's were high. We had to literally get out of the car and go back and be like, hello, we've been here for 30 minutes. There's nobody here. It could not have taken that long to make chicken McNuggets. Anyway, this is how our collegial relationship started. It was hilarious. And I really loved this man. I just fell in love with this man, who he is, his genuine heart and character. And, he's from Bronxville, Texas, and I'm from the Bronx. And what I know is that whenever there is some statistic about poverty, degradation, and suffering, Both the Bronx and Bronxville are at the top of the list, unfortunately, but we've both dedicated our lives to illuminating oppression and upholding the struggles of people of color and Latinx folks in particular.
You've talked about you studying with Professor Manning Marable and you doing research. And in your research on poverty in the United States, Brownsville and the lower Rio Grande Valley coming up a lot repeatedly in your studies. Yeah. And so when you were coming out to Texas and me telling you where you're from, I remember that was sort of the first thing that clicked with you about knowing the region that I'm from, right? And the people that I love.
Well, so I am excited to be hosting with Mayday Space this conversation. I'll just say that I am a writing snob. I'm gonna say it. I'm a writing snob, and there's a story behind that. My first language is Spanish because my parents still don't speak English. And I was made to feel inferior because of that reality. Mm-hmm. And I, in fact, got left back in second grade because English was my second language. And so I was called a second grader by my brother all my life. And then I was like, I'll show you. So the mastery of English is part of my reason for being. And then I pick up this book and I'm like, yo, this man can write. And what I mean by that is not academic writing that's incomprehensible and filled with jargon, but writing that is clear, that is from the heart, that is grounded in incredible research and analysis, but that's accessible to the people. And so that's what we have in the book that Felipe Hinojosa has written. It is a brilliant book. It costs $50, guys, $50, because it's in hardcover. But we're going to give away how many copies?
We got 5 copies.
5 copies. 5 copies. So y'all, that's our hook to keep your asses here until the end of the program, because that's going to come at the end of the program. 5 $50 books. It's a lot of money. All right. So this is not Felipe.
Well, first of all, let me just say thank you. And it's great. Thank you to Mayday Space. Thank you to you, Johanna. And to be able to be here, it's fantastic. I'm humbled and I look forward to having a good time.
Well, listen, you owe me a lot because I've been in bed. I just got up and I had to drink something to revive me. So you owe me.
More okay. McDonald's.
Some McDonald's. He's gonna give me some McDonald's. The first book he wrote was Latino Mennonites, Civil Rights, Faith, and Evangelical Culture in 2014. And he got a fancy prize for that, the Americo Paredes Book Award from South Texas College. He's written other stuff and he's truly a beautiful human being. I just will introduce this subject by saying that in 1969, 2 million young people polled in the United States said that they believed in the necessity of building a revolutionary party. What we don't know is that a significant number of those 2 million students were Latinx people, Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, who joined the civil rights and Black Power movements and the anti-war movement, and the movements against homophobia, heteronormativity, for women's rights, and to build a world that doesn't destroy our environment. And so part of what Felipe has done brilliantly, as I've read through the book today, is that he's identified one of the linchpins of Latinx activism and radicalism, and that is the occupation of churches by revolutionaries, Puerto Ricans and Mexicans in 4 different cities: Chicago, New York, Texas, Houston, and and Los Angeles. So my first question to you is, who are the characters, the people in your book, and what is your major argument about them?
Okay, I've been preparing for this. I have my notes. I think I'm ready to
Don't
go.
embarrass me, please.
I have to make sure I get this right. There's a lot of pressure right now.
I bring you to New York. Get it right.
Listen, I want to say that it wasn't the first time, but a recent, maybe about 10 or 11 years ago, I was in New York City for the American Historical Association. And I took a friend of mine from South Texas and I said, let's go check out this church. You know, he had never heard of it, but of course I had. The First Spanish United Methodist Church plays a major role in this book. And we went up there and we were in near Times Square, one of the hotels, one of the fancy kind of big conference hotels near Times Square. Went up to the First Spanish United Methodist Church. I took pictures. I think my friend took pictures of me standing awkwardly in front of the church. It was very weird and strange, and people were probably wondering what was going on. And then we were like, we're looking for the Nuyorican Poets Cafe. Is it anywhere around here? And they were like, Mijito, where are you at? Maybe this ain't the right, this is not, you are far from it. You need to go to the Lower East Side. So we went back. But at that moment, it dawned on me and it hit me that, you know, if I were to write another book, and at that point it wasn't a given, if I were to write something else, that it would be on this. And so for me, growing up, not in an urban environment, I grew up in a semi-rural environment in South Texas that, you know, big cities for us were in the movies, right? LA, New York, Chicago, not so much Houston, but we had family that had migrated to Houston. And so Houston was the one spot that we would visit every once in a while because I had tios and tias in that area. So it was completely new. And so for me to go to these places and to meet these folks in each of these cities, and I'm focusing on the drive-in is the occupation. Who occupied churches and what were the churches that were being occupied? And so it's the Young Lords organization in Chicago, started by Chacha Jimenez, originally as a street gang in the late 50s, and then coming to political consciousness in '68, and really beginning to work in the neighborhood of Lincoln Park in the north side area, just north of the Navy Pier and so forth there in Chicago. And there were two occupations there that I write about. So the Young Lords being this group of young Puerto Ricans that and Mexicans, and there were other folks in there as well, that knew the story of displacement well from their own histories and their own families' histories, and were going through it there in that neighborhood of Lincoln Park once again as urban renewal policies were beginning to change neighborhoods across the city, across the country. So it's the Young Lords organization in Chicago. In Los Angeles, which is the second chapter, it's a who's who of Chicano and Chicana activists that come together around the closing down of Mexican-American Catholic schools. The cardinal there, James McIntyre, was one of the most conservative cardinals, if not just in the entire country, in the entire world. If anybody was preaching or talking about liberation theology, he would immediately shut them down. And so in 1969, as these Catholic schools were being closed, the church erects a massive building, a massive church called St. Basil's Catholic Church, over $3 million, stained glass windows. It's beautiful. And people start to raise questions around, wait a minute, you're closing schools that are benefiting our young people, and yet you're erecting these huge buildings. And so in Los Angeles, it's a coming together of activists from all over that city that call themselves Católicos por la Raza. From there, I jumped to New York because right at the time that Católicos por la Raza is disrupting Christmas Eve Mass, the Young Lords organization in New York City that you so eloquently write about, that got you the invitation to come to Texas and to impress all of the young students that you impressed when you were here, impressed all of us, were gracious enough, by the way, to stick around late after your talk and sign all of your books for our students And then we hopefully treated you to a nice dinner, certainly better than the McDonald's. So in going to New York, that's the one that I knew about the most. The case of the occupation of the First Spanish United Methodist Church was the one that I had at least heard about and read about. And so the central characters there are Felipe Luciano, Iris Morales, Juan Gonzalez, and everybody else that was involved in that movement. 3 months after, and this is one I didn't know about and just learned later, the Mexican American Youth Organization, or MAYO, M-A-Y-O, occupied a Presbyterian church in Houston, Texas. Young people ages 16 to about 25, 26 years old in each of these cities, all of them dealing with some form of either urban renewal, the destructiveness of white flight and de-investment in the inner city, and the closing down of Catholic schools while erecting, really fancy church buildings and cathedrals. That was what brought them together, and networks, newspapers, conferences where they were meeting one another, getting together with one another, and learning about what they had done in the occupation of each of these places. I found it fascinating that in each of these cases, whether you're talking about a group from Houston going up to Chicago and meeting Chacha Jimenez, or the Young Lords in New York City traveling from New York to Chicago to meet with the folks there, people, even in LA, the Presbyterian pastor, Tony Hernandez, everybody went back to Chicago and said, what we saw in Chicago and what we saw happen there gave us the idea. We would have probably never thought about occupying a church. So that's essentially the book. And these are the characters and the places for me, as somebody that grew up surrounded by God, surrounded by churches everywhere. That was my entire life growing up. My dad, as you mentioned, was a minister. I think I've always, in my own career, have been always really interested in sort of these secret affinities, these things that don't really make sense. And when I think about radicalism, I don't immediately jump to church, right? I don't immediately jump to religion, right? It's often the opposite, right? And I don't know what it is. Maybe you can help me, Johanna, with this. Why historians, especially in our field of Latino and Latina history, or Chicano and Chicana history, for whatever reason, have not included or not talked about the enormous power that the church has had in our communities. Religion is ubiquitous. It is everywhere. And yet, for whatever reason, as historians, we've not done as good a job. One of the reasons that attracted me so much to you, and there's other scholars that have done really great work on this, and I think of Eduardo Contreras' great work on San Francisco and the kind of community organizing in the 1960s and 70s. Eduardo talks a lot about, you read that book, he talks a lot about religious organizations, specifically the Presbyterian Church, funding a lot of the community work that was going on there. You, for as long as I've been following you and reading your work and assigning your essays and articles in my classes, always took the church seriously and always took that occupation seriously. And not only to the point of, well, let me write about it, but to the point of asking the Young Lords about it and asking them, what did it mean to occupy this church? What was that about? And I think too often people have just said, well, the Young Lords occupied McCormick Seminary in Chicago. They occupied the First Spanish United Methodist Church in New York City, and then they jettison and move on, not realizing that there's a whole nother story because of the deep and rich archives that religious folk kept. Nobody's better at keeping religious archives than religious folks. Vicky Ruiz, Chicana historian, said it best. Religious archives are not dead ends. They are gold mines. And she writes this in the late 80s and early 90s in an essay where she's engaging religion. Why we haven't picked up on that, I don't know. Anthropologists have certainly picked up on it. People in literature and cultural studies have picked up on it. We're late to the party as historians, but we're here. So anyway.
So the richest archive that I found on the Young Lords were definitely at the archival collection of the United Methodist Church. Drew, was it at Drew University?
Yeah, in New Jersey.
In New Jersey at Drew University. Incredible archive on what happened. Just rich stuff. So part of what you argue, I think, in the book, because you have an
Oh, I should have. I didn't get to the argument, right? I'm the worst, by the way.
Look,
but I'm
Jesus.
here. I'm here.
Okay, so let me just tell you what I think you're doing. You say that you do, and you say it beautifully, and that's that you are trying to write a religious history as of the social movements and a social history of religion in the 60s. And I think that's brilliant. As I was reading your book and the introduction especially, you called my attention to the fact that, first of all, the churches were at the center of the movements of the 60s, but also Latinx people are religious in some way. We're either recovering Catholics, recovering Pentecostal people, we're cultural Catholics, or we drank the Kool-Aid. And we are connected to the church intravenously. So this is in our DNA. And part of what you suggest is that these occupations were complex because it wasn't just the secular against the sacred. There was a complex intermingling of belief and experience that bears scrutiny. That it wasn't just secular radicals taking over religious institutions. So can you talk to us about that? And can you talk to us about the contradictions of the church that these radicals were amplifying?
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point. I remember talking to Alex Rodriguez in Houston, Texas. He was one of the members of the Mexican American Youth Organization. And we're sitting down and having a conversation. And Alex is telling me just how radical Mayo was. I had like Mayo's, primary documents sort of outlining what they believed and what they stood for. Mayo in its documents had that the church is the enemy of the people. They didn't mess around. They were very, very clear that the church is whack and it's Catholicism and to some extent Pentecostalism and Protestantism that has got us down. And yet, almost like a pivot or like a left turn or right turn, whatever it was, when he's talking to me, he's like, but then we got in the church and we were all badass and we broke the window to get in, and then it was like, we got to fix that shit. Like, we should probably fix that shit, because like mom's probably gonna, mom might say something or whatever. Like, that was central to every one of the folks that I spoke to. The kinds of respect that they had for sacred space, even as they were willing to push it. So they were occupying and they were protecting. I remember talking to Chacha. Chacha threatens McCormick Seminary with not only breaking into the stone building, but he said, we're going to get into that library and we're going to burn your books. We're going to burn everything. And they get in there and the seminary's freaking out. They don't know what. Chacha's like, we weren't going to do that. Are you kidding me? That would have been crazy. But they believed us and it worked, right? But that sort of feeling and that sort of sense of, the kind of love and respect that they had for the church, even as they, not only were criticizing it, but were willing to take it all the way and occupy it. I should note that in none of these cases did these radicals, and I call them radicals very specifically, none of these radicals ever just sort of said, fuck the church, I'm coming in, like, this is what we're doing, I don't give a shit, all of that, none of that. It was always a very calculated, very careful. They went to the pastor of the church. They went to Carranza in New York City at the First Spanish. And, Juan Gonzalez tells me, he's like, he probably saw 5 Che Guevara lookalikes coming at him. What's he going to say to us? The guy's Cuban. There's no way, right? We're not going to get this building. But the fact that they would go to church, that they would try to meet with religious leadership and do all that, and religious leadership in every single case rejecting them And nobody was as fierce, nobody was as strong as the Catholic Church's rejection of the Chicanos in Los Angeles. At least the Protestants were willing to negotiate or do something. Cardinal McIntyre was not having it at all. And it's the Catholic Church, by the way, the only group that actually prosecutes them, 21 of them from Los Angeles, the Católicos 21. Some of them ended up serving time in prison for the disruption that they created. So all of this comes together, and I don't know what to do with this. I'm looking at this and I'm trying to get it right. Meanwhile, I'm trying to understand what it means to be a radical during this era. I'm trying to understand what it means to write a book about Chicanos in Houston and Puerto Ricans in New York City and Mexican immigrants in Chicago.
Right.
And what does it mean to say brown power when some of those folks didn't come to brown power? Some of those folks got to black power way before they did, brown power. And to be able to sort of categorize it and think about it in one way. And so it was a lot of things sort of coming up in terms of not only religious contradictions, but then also political ones that I had to address and that I tried to address as, you and others, try to sort of think about what does it mean to write about the Latinx freedom movement? What does it mean to write about this larger sort of moment in history that was fundamentally pushing back, not just against the church, right, obviously, but against healthcare organizations, against hospitals, against schools, the government, the police, all of these different places. At the same time, understanding that to be a Chicano in Houston is very different than to be a Chicana or Chicano in Los Angeles. I mean, worlds apart. I mean, we're talking corn and flour tortillas, right? I mean, it's very, very different. And so in that sense, that made it all the more difficult. The religious sort of contradictions that emerged tended to be a little easier, believe it or not, to deal with. I will say one more thing about that when we talk about radicals, and this is the work that you do that I'm so indebted to in what I write, is that I wonder what it does to us. And I wonder if ignoring the church as historians or not talking about religion, or maybe just talking about religion when it has to do with culture or performance and so forth, but not with politics, I wonder if it forces us to rethink what radicalism means. I wonder if it pushes us to think about radicalism in a way that we begin to humanize these folks, that we begin to see them as master negotiators, that we begin to see them as organizers that were willing to take risks and do things that sometimes I think radicals don't get too much credit for. And one of the things that came through with all of that in their negotiations and all of that was that radicals make it easier for moderates. Radicals pave the way for moderates and reformers to do their thing. And what the Young Lords did, what Mayo did, what Católicos did in each of these cases actually helped Latino and Latina religious folk and clergy people inside the church. This is 1969. Latino clergy were not absent. They were marching with Cesar Chavez from the early 60s, from 62 all the way to 69. You're talking about almost a 10-year period there where they had been involved in different political movements, and especially with the United Farm Worker movement. And yet nobody knew who they were. They were still the invisible minority. In Chicago, they called them, these people sound like far off thunder. Who are these Spanish speaking folks? We don't know who they are. The Young Lords and Mayo and Católicos changed all that, put them on the map.
So, okay, so religion is all over the movements. If we take a step back, I was just listening to Martin Luther King's speeches through the show I host on WBAI because it was the anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination on April 4th. And to hear Martin Luther King is to hear just a seamless fusion of secular politics and aspirations for freedom and the best of Christianity. It's a seamless fusion.
Yeah.
So really religion is everywhere. Even if we think about Malcolm X. Malcolm X was part of the Nation of Islam.
Right.
And of course, we know that the churches were the were the anchors, the foot soldiers of the civil rights movement were found in the churches. So religion is everywhere, but it gets invisibilized. What I'm interested in is what you suggest, and I haven't finished reading the book, so I don't know if you developed this, but it's that radicals, in fact, forced the church to live up to its highest ideals and aspirations, right? Radicals who we think about as secular. And that actually changes our understanding of the church, but it also changes our understanding of radicals. That we tend to think that radicals are godless, people, but in fact, a lot of what fuels radical revolutionary politics is love and some kind of spirituality, that there's something that's human, commonly human about us that we must preserve and amplify. So can you talk about the stories of individuals who were radicals, who demanded more of the religion? Like, I'm thinking of Felipe, I'm thinking of Juan, I'm thinking of Chacha.
Yeah.
All of these revolutionaries were like intravenously connected to the church when they were children. So tell us about that.
So one of the best interviews that I did, and I interviewed a lot of fantastic people throughout the writing of the book, was Felipe Luciano. We met at La Fonda Boricua. The music was really loud. I was a little worried because you're trying to record the interview too, see what the sound is going to come out like, but it was great. And in all of that,
tell us who Felipe Luciano is, because I'm not sure that people, are in the know here.
So Felipe Luciano was one of the original Young Lords, one of the original participants, one of the leaders, top leadership within the organization. He was a poet, a writer, somebody that grew up, had been in jail in the early 1960s, and was extremely articulate. He was a preacher, grew up in a very conservative Pentecostal home. Everything was about the Bible and going to church. When he's telling me about his church experiences, it reminded very much of my own. And it's his understanding of church services that tells the Young Lords, this is when you will have a chance to voice your concerns at the First Spanish United Methodist Church durante la hora de testimonio, right? Church is gonna open up and there's gonna be a space for people to speak, and this is when you'll be able to speak. Felipe Luciano was, certainly on top of all of that, but one of the most vocal leaders in terms of the Young Lords and its relationship to the church. In our interview, being able to go back to the church and sort of call it out and name its contradictions was central to the work that he did. And he did it better than anybody else because he could recite scripture. The way he told me was that in East Harlem, they're shoving the Bible down your throat when you're growing up as a kid, right? And so that was a big part of who he was. Never seen himself as being a-religious or completely void of spirituality. It was something that was very, very central to him, and that came through very clearly in the interview that we had in the conversation, that took place. But anytime that he talks and you've heard him speak, it's like hearing a Pentecostal preacher. There's a cadence, there's a rhythm, there's a way that he does things, and the way that he talks about things. In one of the first melees of the church, I think it was around December 14th, it might have been about 2 weeks, maybe earlier than that, before the Young Lords occupy the actual building. The police came in, there was a big fight, he was hit, and his arm broke, I think, is the injury that he got, and he was arrested that day and told not to get within 100 feet of the church. And so I guarantee you, a week later, he was 100 feet away from the church, talking about opening the church, citing Bible verses. You see Juan Gonzalez doing the same thing all of these folks had a deep spirituality and a deep connection to faith, even as much as they rejected it and turned away from it.
So Felipe Luciano is also Black, right? He's a Black Latino, Afro-Puerto Rican, who was also quite connected to the Black arts movement and to the Black Power movement. I'm just going to also remind our listening audience that Baldwin was a child preacher. Baldwin, right? So religion is everywhere in the 60s, but it's also invisible.
Yeah.
Okay, so tell us a little bit more about you and why, and after that, I want you to tell me some of your favorite stories, but tell us a little bit more about your biography and what brings you to this topic. My professor in college, Suzanne Obler, told me one day, I was like always embattled with Suzanne Obler. If you go to graduate school, whatever you write about is going to be very personal. And I was like, what are you talking about? No, I'm not trying to do the personal. I'm not trying to do the identity thing. I'm trying to understand history and society. And she was right. Ultimately, what we write about is profoundly personal. It's something that we're trying to resolve deep inside of us. So tell us, who are you and what brings you to this incredibly creative project?
You know, I grew up in a very religious home. My father and my parents were migrant farm workers. The reason that I write about religion is because my parents found it in the tomato fields of Ohio, of northwestern Ohio. And my dad had grown up nominal Catholic. My mom had grown up Methodist. My mom was much more committed to the church than my dad was at the time. But I also grew up in a church that was it was a Mexican-American working class church in Brownsville that was very engaged in its community. We had a gymnasium. Kids from the neighborhood would come play basketball. I played a lot of basketball growing up. We were a sanctuary church in the late 80s and early 90s. There were constantly these white folks from the Midwest and different places that would come down on their way to Central America, on their way to do different kind of, not evangelism, but social service work. So there were always all of these examples. If you know anything about the Mennonite tradition, you know that they're pacifist and very pro-social justice. I grew up knowing I was not going to serve in the military, that was not going to be an option for me, even though I did have friends that did serve. When I got sort of the political consciousness raises, and you're like, I want to write more about the Chicano movement. I think I was a little surprised that the only work on religion that I could find was in theological studies. If you wanted to read anything about Latino culture, that you had to go to the church folks, you had to go to the theologians. And that was fine, but I grew up the son of a preacher, and so I'm a storyteller. And from the beginning, wanting to know, I could not have been the only Mexican American in the country to have grown up in the kind of church that I grew up in, right? This could not have been a solitary kind of experience. When I knew that I wanted to go to graduate school, my advisor, Lupe San Miguel, is a preeminent educational scholar. He writes education history. And I go to him and I tell him, I said, I want to write about religion and politics. And I think he might have been smoking at the time. He was like, I'll support you. The only thing that matters is that if you have support from your advisor, right? You don't need somebody who's a professional in the field. Lupe took me on as a student. And I was one of the few, not one of the few, I was the only person writing anything remotely to do with religion. I'm very thankful and very grateful that the cohort that I had at the University of Houston, where I did my PhD work, was always very supportive of me. They didn't understand me. They thought maybe I was going to break into prayer every once in a while, or that maybe I didn't drink alcohol or whatever, but they loved me, and that's all that mattered, right? And so I remember, we would organize panels, because when you're coming up as a grad student, you got to get on these panels and you want to go to conferences, and I'm going to meet so-and-so and all of that. So they would invite me. We're going to do this Chicano movement panel. I mean, I write about the Chicano movement. I just write about religion. And they were always like, wow, I don't know if it fits, but yeah, you know what? We'll put you in there. And I was always the tagline and beyond. So it was always like Chicano movement politics and beyond. We'd always put that in the conference panel sort of celebration, right? That's, you know, coming up in that sort of environment in Chicano history, where there are many more folks now, believe it or not, certainly. But back then it was very difficult. But I knew that I didn't want to jump to religious studies. I knew I didn't want to jump to theology. I'm a historian. That's what I'm trained in. And I'm a storyteller. And so to be able to sort of think about these stories and be able to write them down is something that I've been committed to from the very beginning. And I know that with this book and thinking about these church occupations, you know, they fascinated me. And I wondered why people weren't going to religious archives, because I thought that's where the story's at. I mean, you're going to find stuff at NYU, you're going to find stuff at DePaul, but it's not going to be anything like if you go to the McCormick archives, or it's not going to be anything if you go to like the you know, Drew University, or mind you, the Presbyterian archives in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which are really a gold mine. You can find it in the archives in Philadelphia, and they're online, by the way. You can go on and listen to James Forman, the former leader of SNCC and the writer and author of the Black Manifesto that was asking for $500 million from churches, from white churches. You can go and listen to him speak.
As reparations.
As reparations. And you can also go and hear Obed Lopez. You can hear Obed Lopez from Chicago, the leader of the Latin American Defense Organization of LADO. You can hear him give his speech. And I knew that that's where the story was, and I knew I had an in, and so I jumped on it. But it is biographical, there's no question.
Okay, so let me give you a little bit of therapy, kid.
Go ahead, do it.
And by the way, he's drinking. The Mennonite is drinking here. He's going to tell us in a minute, because we got this celebration. This celebration of his book. So he's got someone who's made up a drink for him. This is what I see. And we're going to open it up for questions right now. I see that you grew up in a church that was ultimately outward looking and about the manifestation of freedom and justice in the world. I mean, you grew up in the tomato fields, right? Where your parents worked in the middle of nowhere, America. And that's where a church was born. So the kind of church that you inhabited as a child is not necessarily the church that the United States embraces, not the colonist church that the United States embraces. And so part of what you have done in your research is to amplify or disinter the radical aspirations and history within the church as perhaps brought to the church from the outside. I mean, it kind of mirrors your life, right? Because church means something very different to you than it means to me as a cultural Catholic, right? In a much more colonized church experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, for me, it's very intimate and it's very personal. And I can't see it. I can't help but see it everywhere. When I look at photographs, you see clergy there, you see people that are offering up prayers. You see the fact that part of the success of the civil rights movement was the way that it elevated segregation, the way that it elevated these issues to moral causes, right? It wasn't just about democracy. It was a moral issue that goes at the very core of the nation.
Right.
And to be able to sort of call that out. I heard, I'm sitting down and I'm talking to an activist in Los Angeles, and we're at a restaurant, we're having coffee, and Richard Martinez, who was a labor leader, labor organizer in Los Angeles, and I'm interviewing him, and one of the first things he says to me is like, I'm surprised it's taken this long for people to get with it. And one of the things he says to me that I'll never forget is, without Protestant ministers, there is no Chicano movement in Los Angeles. Now, I don't know what to do with that. I didn't know what to do with that in the book. I didn't even develop that idea because I think there's still so much more research that needs to be done. But if you look at the leaders that were behind the scenes, if you look at the funding that was coming from major Protestant denominations to different groups, if you look at the fact that at Church of the Epiphany, the Brown Berets had space, you know, they could congregate. I talked to Carlos Montes, you know, former Brown Beret, still very active in the Los Angeles area. You know, one of the things that he's saying is that the church didn't judge us. The church just let us be. We would fuck up all the time. And Church of the Epiphany was like, just come on back. And La Raza newspaper takes off from there. It's quite significant. And I think it deserves more attention. But when I hear, you know, Richard saying that to me, I didn't know what to do with that. I think there's certainly more that we need to do, as there is in all kinds of areas of the Latino freedom movement. There's much more that we haven't yet explored. Welfare rights, hospitals, healthcare, everything. That I think we still have a lot of work to do.
I just want to read. I want to read some of the comments here on the chat. So many people would never have been activists or organizers were it not for their faith. That's definitely something that both of us learned in interviewing the young lords. But I'd like to open it up for questions. And as we do, can you very briefly talk to us about your drink and its origins?
Yes. Okay. So a good friend of my sister's who's a bartender in Brownsville, and you know, I don't know if the lighting isn't as great here, but who's a bartender in Brownsville, Texas, my hometown, put together this drink. It's called the Apostle. So let me.
The Apostle.
It's called the Apostle. All right.
Nice.
Now, all I had was a mason jar. I don't have a nice cocktail glass or whatever, but there it is. The recipe, by the way, to make the Apostle is available. You want it, you can send me a message, send Mayday a message, whoever it is, but it's there. It's got tequila, hibiscus tea, agave syrup, and you just shake it, put some ice in it, a little bit of Topo Chico at the end, and you're golden. So
a little bit of who?
Enjoy. A Topo Chico, it's the agua mineral water. Okay,
mineral water. Wow. Hibiscus, Jamaica is in there. All right, he's Mexican. Claro está. Okay, let's open it up for questions. I think that our Mayday hosts are going to handle calling on you. Where'd you go, Felipe?
Okay,
what the hell?
I turned on some lights.
Okay. Oh, very nice. This is Sasha. Hi, everyone. I'm one of the other co-directors at Mayday. Nobody has been sending me any questions. So far, we've got one question. So not to put you on the spot, but Bobby Rivera, would you like to come on the mic and ask your question?
Our colleague, Bobby Rivera.
Saludos. Thank you, Felipe. Thank you. This is such a wonderful contribution to the study of religion and politics. And as I kept hearing Johanna, saludo, Johanna say religion is everywhere, but it's invisibilized. I was wondering if you could just share a bit more about your thoughts on the relationship, the mutually shaping relationship between religion and culture or religion and society. Because sometimes my sense is reading social scientists, it's society over determining what religion is, right? And then you read some theologians or religious studies scholars, and it's religion over determining what society or culture is, right? But it seems to me that your work is striking a very nice balance, right? In helping us to think about a mutually shaping relationship between the two.
Yeah. Hey, Bobby, so good. I'm so glad you're on here, man. You know, you can help me talk about this stuff and to sort of explain it better. Yeah, you know, I just wanted to make sure that when, you know, religion is such a private experience. People often don't want to talk about it, or if they do, you're gonna sort of see it as sort of this meta narrative that is clouded by kind of institutional mandates or conservative religion. There's a fascination with conservative religious folks. I mean, if you just go to Amazon or wherever you buy your books, look in religion, and it's folks that are trying to understand white supremacy within religious context, that are trying to understand, the moral majority, whatever it is. If you would look at the book section on kind of progressive religious movements, it's thin. There's not as much. And I think the notion that people have taken, especially with Latinos, is that there's this affinity with conservative politics. You saw it most recently in the analysis with the Trump and Biden election. People blaming, this has got to be the fault of evangelical religion. This has got to be the fault of the Catholic Church, when in fact it's certainly a lot more complicated than that. But I think with religion, I think this is why the anthropologists are so much better at it. I think you got to go to the local. You got to go down to do the oral histories, to talk to the folks in the pews. Because I mean, I was talking to my tío Daniel, who's been a Methodist for a long, long time, and one of the things that he was mentioning to me was that a lot of these movements were not reaching the pews, that people in the Methodist Church were not getting it, that it wasn't coming all the way down, that if you had activists or whatever, that it was somehow at the institutional level. That was a different case altogether in these occupations that I cover, because this got directly to the pews. These were activists and radicals talking directly to the folks and going into the church and having conversations with them. And it wasn't always easy. Católicos por la Raza got a lot of hate mail. You can go to the University of Santa Barbara, the University of California in Santa Barbara, and go to the archives there and look at the stacks of letters that they got from Mexican Catholics that were not happy with what they were doing. But that kind of micro level history and getting at those stories and those complexities is where I sort of wanted to start, and where I wanted to kind of, base it. I know that as historians, we're looking at sort of these big themes. We're looking at change over time, all of this. But I think, especially doing Latino history, the local matters, the barrio matters. This is the locus of our communities. And in these barrios, you're dealing with religion and you're dealing with church in one way or another, whether it's negative or positive. So I appreciate that comment, Bobby. I tried my best, and hopefully, people can take this book, tear it up and go and write their own in terms of the kind of politics that folks want to talk about and really push back. I hope that it not only starts a conversation, because essentially I'm looking back and I'm grateful to Tim Matolina, I'm grateful to Lara Medina, to Arlene Sanchez-Walsh, Gaston Espinosa, others that have sort of laid that groundwork to get us going. I mean, I remember reading, Gaston Espinosa is a historian, religious historian at a Claremont McKenna. I read his dissertation in the late 90s and thought, that's what I want to do. I want to write what he's writing. He's writing about Pentecostals and politics. That's what I want to write about. I think we've got certainly a lot of work to go.
I want to just read something from the chat here by Dwayne Clinker, who says, I am an old revolutionary from the 60s, and the Young Lords were an inspiration. And yes, I am a radical and a revolutionary because of the values that came from my Zion faith. I later became a liberationist pastor. And yes, there is a visceral link between some sense of spiritual radicalism and what organizers call cold anger and the revolutionary necessity and trajectory. So yeah, so this profound sense of morality and anger at the world as it is encouraged by the higher morals of the church. If the church is true to its ideals. Anybody else would like to speak?
Yes, I actually have gotten a lot of questions. People, I think, were just so riveted by the conversation that they do not have time to type their questions earlier, but now we have plenty. So let me see if Barbara, would you like to ask your question on the mic, or I can read it for you if you'd rather.
The mic is great. Thank you. Hi, Felipe. Thanks so much for this book. I just finished the introduction, so perhaps you get to this later in the book. And I also joined the chat late, so I'm not sure if you got to this earlier, but I was really interested in the ways that you describe how these activists are collaborating with, inspired by, and also conspiring alongside Black Power activists. And I was wondering, I just finished my dissertation and I'm writing about sanctuary in the borderlands, but really indebted to Black studies and Indigenous studies and poetics of relation and the shipped and the waked and a lot of terms that Black studies scholars use. So I'm wondering how your project, because these activists are kind of engaged in a poetics of relation with Black Power activists and maybe Red Power activists, I'm not sure. But yeah, how you draw on different intellectual traditions, or if you're kind of conversation with Black studies or Indigenous studies.
Well, Black studies, thank you, first of all, Barbara, for your great question. You know, there's no question in terms of thinking about not just Black studies as a field, but the actual sort of pragmatic politics that come out of James Forman's Black Manifesto. That was if I'm going to anywhere to sort of write about radical religion and radical politics, I'm going to the Black freedom movement. And in talking about the engagement with religion, looking at James Forman and his writing of that Black Manifesto, that's what got me excited, turned me on initially about what I wanted to sort of write about and think about. People often go around thinking that, whether or not James Forman's manifesto succeeded, whether it didn't, that's irrelevant to me. The question for me is the ways in which those radical politics opened the door for, again, moderate Latino and Latina clergy that started to benefit from these Protestant denominations that no way we're going to give Forman that much money, but that we're going to dish it out anyway. And we're still going to give some funds to community service work and to the things that were going on in local neighborhoods and so forth. You also can't talk about the Latino freedom movement without the Black freedom movement. These are entangled movements. I know that we had, as Latinos in our freedom struggle, there were questions and ideas that were specific to our context and our culture. But when my organizers, they're looking at SNCC and they're learning as much as they can from the Black freedom struggle. And I think that's an important component as I tell each of these chapters and each of these stories, to get at how these activists were not only engaging, politics and engaging the work that they did, but also then engaging each other and engaging the church. They would make comments about SNCC and about Forman and his thing and wanting to do it radically different. I think that was sort of central to me. I just don't think that you can talk about the Latinx freedom movement and struggle without basing it and having a tight bond with the Black freedom struggle and the Indigenous freedom struggle. I mean, the Indians of all tribes is occupying Alcatraz at exactly the same moment. Right when Católicos por la Raza is disrupting Christmas Eve Mass, Indians of all tribes is on Alcatraz Island doing their thing, keeping an occupation that was certainly much longer than any of the ones I cover in this book.
Can you tell us about James Forman? Because there might be people here who don't know who James Forman is and what he did, very quickly.
James Forman was a former leader of SNCC, left SNCC, and worked for the Black Economic Development Council, was the author of a document called the Black Manifesto that essentially called on $500 million from white Protestant churches and Jewish synagogues as reparations for slavery. And he went from place to place. He first presents it in April in Detroit at the Black Economic Development Council there, but he's disrupting services at Riverside Church in New York City. Others that are joining him from Union Theological Seminary, by the way, going and occupying some of these Presbyterian and Methodist churches that had their offices, their central denominational offices in New York City. Foreman is getting all this started. I should say really quick, it's Foreman that gets Obed Lopez onto that agenda at the Presbyterian National Conference in San Antonio that I write about. And as charismatic as Foreman was, he was very attuned to what the Young Lords had started to do in Chicago.
Anyone else want to chime in here? Sasha?
I would say we should go to Jimmy Patino if you would like to ask your question.
Absolutely. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing good, man. It's good to hear your voice.
Good to see you, man. Brilliant as always. It got me thinking about a lot of questions. One thing I gather from that I'm just mesmerized with is just the breaking of this binary between the religious, the spiritual, and the secular, right? And so it has me thinking a lot about, you know, the spiritual aspects to radicals in particular. And it led me to think about one thing that the Chicano movement activist Herman Baca told me, activist from San Diego, was that the Chicano movement broke three kind of sacrosanct institutions open: the Democratic Party, the military, and the church. And think about how work has addressed, you know, the Vietnam War and the you know, the disproportionate number of deaths that were occurring with Chicanos and other folks of color. Of course, the Democratic Party and its limitations. I think I agree with you that more work needs to be done on the church, right? So my question is, what led for these activists to rise up or intervene in such a sacrosanct? And maybe there's a generational aspect to this in terms of occupying the Catholic Church. I mean, that's, you know, if we think about our elders and what they would think of that, right? That's a big deal. So what led them to kind of do that in your estimation? And what was the result? What's the legacy in terms of maybe the church's relationship with the people, so to speak? So I'll ask that.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Jimmy. Jimmy and I have known each other for a long time. I love you to death, brother, and admire the work that you do in the Chicano movement and immigration. I think in every case, it was all, you know, what leads to occupation is this sort of desire and this need for space. And what's happening in each of these American cities, in Chicago, New York, and Houston, and I'll talk, LA is a little different, but in those three cities at least, and in Houston, which you know very well in particular, the de-investment of that inner city in that loop by downtown, in the north side and just north of the downtown area there, and people feeling like they need to do something and rise up and respond to this. The fact that there were no institutions of service, that people needed healthcare, that kids were not getting breakfast. And I think part of what we tend to sometimes forget about radicals is that they are consistently held accountable, or at least value the accountability to the community and to the folks that are in their neighborhoods and in their barrios and so forth. And so to be able to do this and do it in a way that is going to benefit, you know, the community, it was always really, you know, sort of kind of the way that it transpired and the way that it took place. But in every case, it was a sense, this place is a church. And if you're a church, then you're responsible to take care of the least of these. And you are required by what it says in the Gospels, and they're citing scripture, right? To open this up. In Houston, at that Juan Marcos Presbyterian Church, you know, they were not wanting to use the sanctuary. They didn't want to stop people from going to church. They just said, you don't use this building. You're not using it from Monday to Saturday. let us do the kind of work that we want to do here, because we need space. We need a place to meet. In terms of, so I feel like that's in every one of these cases, and in LA a little different, but basically the same idea, that they're fighting to save something that they feel like is slipping away, right? Or at least they need to step up and do something about that. The legacy, Católicos por la Raza in Los Angeles got Cardinal McIntyre to retire 20 or so days later, after the disruption of Christmas Eve Mass. On the day that Cardinal McIntyre retires and makes it known to the world that he's retiring because he does not understand the spirit of the day, on that day, 21 young folks are arrested for what they did and the disruption of Christmas Eve Mass. But they got rid of McIntyre. And if you talk to any one of Católicos, that's what they'll hold up. We got rid of McIntyre, and that was enough for us. You talk to some Catholic historians and they'll say, well, McIntyre was maybe on his way out. I believe Católicos. I believe what they're telling me. They pushed him out, and that's what happened. In Houston, Juan Marcos Church is still active. They work in immigrant rights. They're involved in their community there in the North Side. They've done so for a long time. And I think, when I found the article in the Houston Post, the title comes from the Apostles of Change comes from the title of a Houston Post article that was written 3 years after Mayo had left the church. And a Reverend Jose Burgos, who was from Chicago, by the way, and knew about the occupation in Chicago, comes to Houston, and in that article says, we owe a great debt of gratitude to Mayo. And that in and of itself leads the congregation to the kind of social justice commitment that it's had. First Spanish United Methodist Church continues to do great work. You can follow them on Facebook. In this pandemic, they've been incredible in terms of food pantries and all of that. But sometimes when we're looking at documents or when we're examining things, we sort of see this is when that event ended, and we don't sort of look forward anymore. To find actual documents, to find newspaper articles where people are citing what the occupation did 3 years after the fact and what it meant, and what it does to those spaces, I think is quite significant. One more thing that I'll mention, and then I'll shut up. But the other thing is that in the 1970s, this is the high point of the development of Latino and Latina theological studies. This is the sort of rise, the religious renaissance that Antonio M. Stevens Arroyo, who's a sociologist, Puerto Rican, who writes about. This is this religious awakening that is going on in the 1970s, where you see Justo Gonzalez, Orlando Costas, Ada Maria Isasi Diaz, all of these folks beginning to write and develop and articulate a Latino and Latina theology. And all of that comes out of the kind of grassroots activism and the kind of theology that was being developed on the steps of St. Basil's in LA, on the steps of McCormick in Chicago, in Houston, and in New York City. And I think it's high time in terms of being able to acknowledge how the grassroots did it. It's easy to just say, well, liberation theology in Latin America was coming up and it was a thing, or Vatican II made a significant difference in the church. Those are significant in and of themselves. They're meta events, they're large scale movements. But in 1969, liberation theology had started, but it hadn't really cracked yet. It's these radicals that do it, and that's the argument I make in the book.
Well, that's excellent.
Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you.
Anyone else?
So we do have a few more questions that folks have entered, but I wonder if we should take a moment to do the book giveaway in case people have to leave before 9.
And maybe people could come in together. Maybe we could take 2 or 3 questions at once when we come back.
Sounds good. So I have some trivia questions for the audience to test your knowledge of tonight's topics. Some of the answers were revealed during the conversation. Others, you will have to depend on your own vast reserves of knowledge and experience. So here's how it's going to work. I'm going to say the question out loud and simultaneously post it in the chat for visual learners. And the person who responds the fastest with the correct answer, so the first correct answer that we receive in the chat, is going to win a free copy of Felipe's amazing book signed by the author himself. And if you win, you're gonna message me your mailing address. I'll put my email in the chat. If you'd like to email it to me, that's fine too. And it will be mailed directly to you. Okay? Questions on the rules?
Can I just say that it's a brilliant book that is about religion and social movements, but it's also about the infrastructure of displacement in American society. So it's a really complex text. What's going on with the cities in the post-World War II period?
Right.
Yes. And so we have some of the trivia questions are very hard. Some are more general knowledge level. So is everyone ready to type quickly? We have 5 questions. Each question wins a book. Okay, here we go. First question. We'll start off slow, ease into it.
Easy.
The first question is, what is a seminary? What is a seminary? Felipe, what is the correct answer?
A seminary is a religious school, a religious institution where people go and study about God and the church.
Okay, the first person.
Was that Rosie? Oh, no.
Looks to me, would school to learn ministry?
All of that. It does count.
Theological school, religious school?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna say Dawn. You are the winner of the first book.
All right.
Yay! I know Dawn.
And congratulations / condolences to everyone who answered, but just not quite as fast as Dawn. Ready for the next question. Ready for the next question. So Dawn, send me a message, your mailing address, okay? I'm typing my address, my email address in there if you'd like. Next question. Who was the chairman of the Young Lords?
Oh,
That's 2 answers.
that's 2. Yeah.
Rosie got, oh no. Okay. Felipe, would you reveal the correct answer, please?
Well, there's 2, right? I mean, Chacha Jimenez and I don't remember. Let's see, Felipe Luciano in New York City.
So
Someone said Felipe Hinojosa. Jorge
Not true.
said Felipe Hinojosa.
honorary chairman.
Tocayo. He's my tocayo.
So I'm gonna give that one to Cody C. Cody C was the first with the Chacha Jimenez response in the chat. Although I would like to point out to our great credit as a crowd, many people were quick with that answer.
Good. All
Nice.
right.
Beautiful. Chacha Jimenez and Felipe
All
Luciano.
right. Next question is another.
Give us the little music again.
Yeah, the music was great. We got to do the music. Andale, there you go.
Who started Católicos por la Raza?
Oh, it's a hard one. It's harder. Let me see if I pretend to be like answered.
Who started Católicos por la Raza?
Bam.
Oh man.
I like Rudy G's answer.
No.
He's just cussing in the chat.
Rudy! All right, okay.
I love this.
Rudy, don't worry. There's a couple more questions. You could still get there.
No, Rudy's gonna get it for sure. Rudy's gonna get one. There's no question.
Okay, so Felipe, the correct answer on this one is
Ricardo Cruz.
Ricardo Cruz. I'm gonna give that one to David Satin Lopez.
All right, David.
Wow.
Congratulations.
David,
That's
send me
great.
your
That's
mailing address. You have won a
awesome.
book.
Ricardo Cruz, and it's a $47 book, everybody. So you're
That's
getting
right.
something,
So-
and it's signed. So you can add like another $100 to that.
Okay, 2 more questions. Are we ready?
Oh my gosh.
This one
I
tests
hope I remember these.
your knowledge of scripture. It is, hold on. It is a fill in the blank question, okay? So you just need to tell me what fills in the blank. It is easier for a blank to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Juan Ramirez was lightning speed on
My
that.
Gosh.
And that was quoted in the People's Church at 110th Street in Lexington Avenue, the Young Lords. Juan Gonzalez. Oh, wait, I'm not supposed to say that. Shit.
No, that's okay. So
Well,
Felipe, the correct answer? Fill in the
Yes.
blank.
Camel.
Yes, it is a camel,
111.
and that one was definitely goes to whoever I said before. They
Juan
were-
Ramirez.
Juan
Juan Ramirez.
Ramirez. Juan Ramirez. Congratulations,
wait.
Juan.
Yes. So my last question, I saved my personal favorite of the trivia questions for last. I did not come up with these questions, by the way, Felipe did.
I don't know.
But this is my favorite one. Why did the Chicago Young Lords wear purple?
That was me.
That was Johanna. Johanna came up with that one.
This one's interesting because we have several different theories competing. Not correct, but great idea.
Oh, someone got it.
Gosh.
So this one, the winner is Brianna Ruiz.
Oh, wow.
Felipe, would you explain the origin of the color purple as a choice for the Young Lord?
It's in West Side Story. And that's where they got the color from.
Who in West Side
is
Story?
correct. Oh, I don't know who. Johanna, it was
Sharks.
Johanna's question.
Yeah, it was
So,
the shark.
so the Latino gang in West Side Story wore purple, and Cha-Cha Jimenez told me in an interview, I asked him why purple, and he was like, well, West Side Story was on the big screen and we were inspired. We were like, Puerto Ricans are in Hollywood. That's us. And so they take their colors from West Side Story.
Luckily, representation has come a long way since then. But I think that's a fantastic bit of trivia. And that concludes our 5 questions, or 5 books have been given away.
Yeah, I'm glad I remembered that trivia, you know? I almost forgot.
I am too, because that would have been embarrassing for you.
Oh my gosh, for sure.
So we're at 9 o'clock, a little bit past. It's up to you folks if you want to continue, answer a few more questions pretty quick, or if we should wrap things up.
Maybe we should have like 3 people articulate their questions, and then we'll bring it back to Felipe and he can wrap up.
Okay, so let me tell you, those people are going to be. Dun, dun, dun.
And Josh has put the place where you can buy Felipe's book that's not on Amazon.
And right, it's at the UT Press, and Josh put in a discount code there where you get 30% off and free shipping. So use that code to get that for sure. Thank you, Josh.
Yes, and apologies if we did not get to your question. It is not personal. I'm going to say Allison Parker, Lydia York, and Christina Basti. Allison, you want to start?
Oh, Allison might have left.
Okay.
I'm Lydia.
Next.
I just was catching up with that, the liberation theology not really having taken root yet in the US. So I think you already addressed that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's important with all of this is just to kind of slow things down, maybe slow the 60s down a little bit, because you know, liberation theology was hitting in San Antonio in terms of the Catholic Church much more than it was in LA because of Cardinal McIntyre. And it's not that religious clergy were ignorant of it or whatever, but the fact that the hammer was coming down in LA a lot harder with Cardinal McIntyre. And that's sort of I think what I'd want us to do is to maybe interrogate that a little bit more, and to maybe give, as we're talking about liberation theology and the radical changes in the Catholic Church with Vatican II, as important as those are, that we, you know, match that with the kind of grassroots activism that was happening among Latino and Latina activists in the United States.
Christina, did you want to jump in?
Yeah. Thank you both, and cheers for being here. I was kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit more. I think, Johanna, you mentioned this in like a question, but sort of this distinction between like colonizer religion and like how that's shown up in maybe particularly the United States, and like maybe what is the distinction between a colonizer religion and non-colonized religion? I don't know if that's the right term, but I'm curious if y'all could say more about that and maybe how they relate to each other a little bit, like you know, especially as some being under the umbrella of a same institution or same belief system, how they're different and operate differently within their communities. And yeah, maybe just say a little bit more about that distinction.
I'm going to defer to Johanna in this case, because she's also got a great chapter on the church occupation. And so I would really love to hear what she has to say about that.
Okay, so first, very quickly, Chacha Jimenez told me when I interviewed him in Chicago, and those interviews were just incredible, that they were doing work with the United Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church up there in Chicago, and there was a march, and he thought that what radicals of color needed to do, who were organizing in the community, was to bring the concept of occupation that was happening in the university to the community. So recall that this is the moment when there are occupations at Columbia, at all the major schools, there are building occupations against the war, but also against gentrification in the community, like Columbia's gentrification of Harlem. And so he thought, how do we bring the concept of occupation to our movements in the community that are led by people of color? Let's occupy the church. I'm sure there are other stories, but that was his story. What I learned when I was writing the chapter on the Young Lords occupation of the First Spanish Methodist Church in East Harlem on 111th Street in Lexington is that the predecessors of the United Methodist Church were literally contracted by the US government in the 19th century to run the Indian schools. That's what we're talking about when we talk about the colonizing character of religion in America. So the church was in charge of running these schools whose job it was to strip Native Americans of their culture, their language, their dress, but also Native American perceptions of property, which were none. They didn't believe in private property. They had a communal understanding of the land. So the colonized church is the church that associates a woman's body with shame. The colonized church is the church that controls a woman's body. And part of what I learned in the interviews I conducted with women is that that was traumatizing. And it's traumatizing today, right? That somehow your body is associated with sin as a woman. And so the young lords and others, Católicos por la Raza, and are interrogating that oppressive character of European religion. And we can go on, but essentially the colonial project was justified through religion and the teachings of God, and there's a proselytization of the natives that happens. It's essentially a form of control. That's what the young lords and radicals argue, that religion, Juan Gonzalez in one of his speeches says, religion has so colonized our minds that we do not see inequality because we are so busy thinking in the hereafter. And part of what I think they try to do is to force the church to be true to the Church of Jesus, the true Church of Jesus, which, as Felipe suggested, is about amplifying and meeting the needs of the least of these.
I tell students, and I told them today in my religion in American history class, if you're a Christian and if that's your identification, stop reading Paul, the epistles, the letters that he wrote to the churches, and go back to the Gospels. Go there, start there. That's the centerpiece of the faith. And if you go there, that's really where, whether we're talking about James Cone and Black liberation theology, or we're talking about Gustavo Gutierrez and Latin American liberation theology, or the verses that the young lords and Mayo and Católicos were citing, this is where they're coming out of: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, out of these four Gospels in the New Testament. And I think that's significant. And part of me saying that we need more work is not only, we need to publish more books or whatever it might be, but I think for me, the miracle is these kinds of secret affinities, these sort of radicals that are meeting up with religious leaders in the church, and to be able to understand that and to be able to really sort of clarify how important it was to our movements, I think would serve us well. I understand people wanting to know why people are conservative and conservative theology and conservative religion. I get that. But fuck, like, we don't know enough about what makes people progressive or what gets them to move and to action, and especially if you're a person of faith.
And a person of color.
Exactly.
An oppressed group within
the
colonized church, or the colonial church. Sasha?
Thank you. Yeah, so I have a couple announcements to wrap things up, and then I'm going to let Felipe say any closing words. And there's some talk in the chat of folks wanting to have a toast to the book, to tonight, to the scholarship, the ideas. So if possible, we're going to have Rudy lead that at the end. Okay. So from Mayday Space, I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who was here, who was part of this wonderful evening of conversation. We really appreciate it. And we really hope that also, if you're in New York in particular, you come check us out once things start opening back up. We have, among many other things at our space, a radical library that is going to be fully equipped with a copy of Felipe's book as well. If you're not able to buy it, you can always come and take it out for free from Mayday. And so we hope you'll also follow us on social media and find out about more great events like this. I'm also going to post one opportunity that we have right now in the chat is if you own a guitar but don't know how to play it, or you do know some but you would like to learn more, we are offering among our online programming classes right now, guitar lessons that have been going for a little while and have been really successful, and the students have really enjoyed them. So we have a great instructor who is open to new people registering now. So you can use those links to do that if you'd like. And definitely, Felipe, if you're ever in New York City, we would love to have you in our physical space as well and collaborate again in the future.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it.
Okay, so very briefly, we just want to announce that we are working together on a project that's pretty national on Latinx youth in the 60s and their movements. It's a photography exhibit at the Smithsonian, which is going to open probably in 5 years. So we are working collaboratively with others on this project. It's really exciting. And yeah, I'm excited to do this work with you, Felipe, but I want to tell us, lead us out.
Well, I'm just eternally grateful. There were, just to have you, Johanna, lead this and Mayday Space collaborate and do all of the work to organize it and to put everybody together, to have the people that I know and that I love that are out there that I know are watching. I've seen Rudy and Jimmy asked a question, and some people that for a long time, I don't want to get all emotional porque soy bien chillón and I'm a crybaby, so I won't do that. But just a lot of love. Thank you to Bobby Rivera, who's out there as well, and other folks that I know are watching, some of my grad students that are out there making fun of me right now, but it's fine. I really appreciated this conversation in a moment where we can't gather, in a moment where it's difficult to bring everybody together. I really appreciate the celebration of this work. And so let's do this toast. I want to do this toast. So is Rudy going to lead it?
I guess I will lead it, yes.
Yes, you will, sir.
Okay, well, so Felipe, thank you for an amazing talk. You're my bromano. We have a bromance. I love you. Jimmy loves you. We all love you. Thank you for an enlightening evening, for who you are, this amazing storyteller, academic, student, friend, father, et cetera, et cetera. We love you. Salud.
Salud.
Salud. Salud, everybody.
Salud.
Thank you, brother.
We can cry now. It's okay. I think we can cry now.
We can cry.
So this is the book party, and we want to thank Mayday Space for hosting it.
Thank you, Mayday
Thank you.
Space.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was beautiful.
Absolutely our pleasure. And again, thank you everyone for coming. It's wonderful to celebrate this book.
All right, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Everybody's talking about this country state. We're getting new power every hour, just about with every Christian faith. We're killing up our leaders. It don't matter none black or white. And we all know it's wrong. And we're gonna fight to make it right. And mighty, straight and wide, your black and white power.
This was
nice.
This is it.
This is it. And
this is it.
This was played
in the church.
In the church.
Yes.
Give this some thought. In stupidness we've all been caught. There really ain't no difference. If you cut, you're gonna bleed. Might I get a little deeper? Human lives from the semen sea.